Straight Shift with the Car Chick, the podcast that's all about cars, buying, selling, fixing, and driving, and sometimes running fast if you're the car chick. Now, here she is.
Welcome, everyone, to the Straight Shift. It's the end of July, and this is the time of year when I start getting a lot of requests from parents to buy cars for their child. Either the kid is going to be a junior or senior in high school this fall, or maybe they're going off to college. But the summer is a very popular time for parents to start thinking about getting that first car for their kid. So today I want to talk about teen drivers. What are some of the challenges that we as adults, as parents, have for kids when we teach them how to drive, getting them that first car? What cars are the best cars to buy for them? And how do you monitor their driving behavior? How do you help keep them safe on the road? And what are you doing as a driver yourself that might be endangering your child when they start learning to drive? So today is all about keeping our kids safe. And when I say I realize I don't have human children. My children are cats, so I really shouldn't have to worry about them driving ever. But I do have nieces and nephews, and so many of my clients have kids. And so I kind of, become a surrogate parent in my head in terms of helping them and empowering them to keep those kids safe. It is something that I'm very passionate about. My own nephew, who's, oh my God, he's going to be turning 19 next month. That's just really frightening. But he was in a very, very serious car accident a little over a year ago. And, even though he is a very, very good driver, I mean, come on, what would you expect from, a kid that's been going to the racetrack with me since he was still, in his mother's stomach? So, but it can happen to anybody. And some of the statistics that I'm about to share with you are quite frankly terrifying. And, I know how I felt when I got the phone call from my sister saying that Cam had been in this horrible accident, and she started texting me pictures, and, my heart stopped. I couldn't breathe. And so, I have just an inkling of what it must feel like to be a parent. And I saw what she went through, and I've seen a lot of other parents go through similar situations. So that's why I'm really passionate about helping parents make the right decisions to help keep their children safe on the road. Because the reality is, a third of all of the deaths for kids between the ages of 13 and 19 occur in a motor vehicle crash. That is 1/3. It's the top killer of teenagers in America are motor vehicle crashes. And there are so many things that we can do to stop this and to keep our kids safer. 16-year-olds obviously have the highest crash rates of any other drivers of any other age because they're new to it. They don't have the skills, they don't have the experience. And on top of that, they still have a teenage brain, which isn't fully formed, and they're not necessarily good at, judgment. The judgment center of their brain has not fully formed yet. And so we can't realistically expect them to make the same kind of decisions and have the same kind of judgment that we as older adults do. Not that I'm saying that the judgment of us adults couldn't stand for a lot of improvement when we're behind the wheel as well, but teenagers have less of a capacity to even make those decisions. Over half of kids admit that they talk on the phone or text while they drive. Now, that statistic applies to adults too. Adults might not be willing to admit that, but you combine all the distractions, playing the music loud on the radio, which kids love to do, having other drivers, other teenagers in the car that they're yapping away and talking and having fun with. All of these things are huge distractions. And as I have preached before, and I will continue to preach, distracted driving is the number one cause of accidents and traffic fatalities. Even, kids are drinking and driving. They obviously don't have good judgment in that respect because they're doing underage drinking, which unfortunately a lot of kids do. And then they combine that with getting behind the wheel of a car. And it's almost always deadly. And only 44% of teenagers said they would even feel comfortable speaking up if they were in a car with one of their friends who was driving dangerously or driving impaired. Kids, want to be accepted, and so they're scared to speak up. They don't say, "Hey, you know what? I'm not safe with your driving. Pull over. I'm getting out," or "I'm not going to get into this car with you. You are not sober enough to drive," or "You're acting crazy. I don't feel safe driving with you." They don't say these things. And so they get themselves into situations that are much, much more dangerous. Teenagers that have involved parents, however, that have talked to them about these things and who exhibit, good driving behaviors and set those boundaries about, zero tolerance for distractions while driving or drinking and driving. Parents that set those firm boundaries and are very proactive with their kids and very involved with their kids driving, those kids are much less likely to have an accident, or to get into a car with another kid who is not going to be exhibiting, driving behaviors that are going to be safe. So let's talk a little bit more about how we can keep our kids safe on the road, and by extension, therefore, keep everyone else on the road safe as well, because they're not just putting themselves at risk when they get behind the wheel. They're putting the lives of the other drivers on the road at risk as well. So the first thing that you can do as a parent to keep your kids safe is to put them behind the wheel of the right type of car. There are definitely vehicles that are more safe than others, particularly for a teenage driver. And don't ask your kid for his or her opinion. Kids want something cool. They want something fun. And I remember having these conversations with my parents when I was a kid and we were out shopping for my first car. I was a car person for starters. So this was mostly my father's fault anyway, because he had gotten me into cars when I was really little. So of course I wanted a sports car. I wanted something cool, something that would go fast or something really different. And my mother wanted me behind the wheel of, her very safe and boring station wagon. So we had these arguments, and kids, they want what they want. They don't put the safety considerations first. And so, as the parent, as the adult, you have to put your foot down and say that safety is the highest priority. Insurance costs are another really high priority. And sometimes that can be a good way to win this argument with your child. Say, that's fine. You can drive whatever car you want as long as you pay for it and you pay for the insurance. And if you show them the difference in the insurance costs between one car and another, then, they start to change their mind if they think that they're going to be responsible for paying for that insurance or a portion of that insurance. So, that pretty much eliminates your Mustangs, your big SUVs, anything that the kid might consider cool, because they are more dangerous to drive, and the insurance companies know that. And the insurance companies are going to charge a heck of a lot more money for putting a child behind the wheel of a more dangerous car. I mean, even as adults, our insurance rates, when we drive those cars, are higher than if we drive a boring 4-cylinder sedan, like a nice Toyota Corolla or a Camry. They're not the most exciting cars necessarily, but they're safe. And so talk to your insurance agent first if you're considering buying a car for your child, because every insurance company is a little bit different. And I am not an insurance agent, and I'm not going to pretend to really understand all their little magic formulas that go into how they calculate the insurance rates. But talk to your agent, because each insurance company is a little bit different in how they do their formulas, and ask, what's going to be the most economical on the insurance to put my child behind the wheel of? A lot of parents think that small cars are dangerous in a crash, and that can be very true. You definitely want to look for a vehicle that has really good crash test ratings. The more airbags, the better. I mean, if they could fit 100 airbags into this car to basically encase your child in bubble wrap, that would be fantastic. And insurance companies do give you better rates for vehicles that have tons and tons of airbags. But, parents think that if they put their kid in a big vehicle, they're going to be safe. It's like, I want my kid to drive a tank so they'll be safe. That's actually not true, because the larger the vehicle, the harder the vehicle is to control. You put a kid behind the wheel of an SUV, and several things can happen. First of all, they're going to cram as many friends in there as possible, and that's going to drastically increase their driving distractions. And that vehicle is going to be a lot harder to control in the rain. If they have to take evasive action, it's going to be a lot more susceptible to rollover in the event of taking evasive action or in an accident. So you need to strike a balance between, the car itself, keeping the child safe in terms of airbags and size and crumple zones, and being easier to control. Because really what you want to do ideally is avoid that accident altogether. Not just keep them safe when they're in a crash, but actually prevent them from crashing in the first place. And I don't think that we place enough emphasis on that in our American driving society in general. And if you've been listening to my podcast or my Shut Up and Drive web series at all, you know how passionate I am about driving skill and paying attention when you're driving. And the number one safety feature in any car is the idiot behind the wheel. So teaching your kids good driving behaviors and getting them into a school that teaches good driving skills and how to make the right decisions given that their brain judgment center is not fully formed yet. This is really important. So I'm going to just take a really quick break from talking about the cars themselves and what they should have and get on my driving soapbox for a minute and talk about really teaching the kid how to drive. Most kids learn how to drive from their parents. Either we actually actively teach them how to drive, like my father taught me how to drive, or they're learning to drive from the moment we stick them in the back seat, in the car seat when they're a little kid. Kids absorb everything. They pay attention when you don't realize they're paying attention. So when you are driving and you are yelling at other drivers and experiencing road rage and engaging in poor driving behaviors yourself, your kid is paying attention. He or she is absorbing that behavior and thinking, oh, mommy and daddy are doing this or driving like this, therefore it's okay. This is the right thing to do. Just like they learn their vocabulary from us, they also learn their driving behaviors from us at a very young age. So even if you don't have teenagers yet, your kids are still, 2 years old and in a car seat in the back, don't think that the way you are driving right now is not influencing how they are going to drive in the future. So watch your own driving behaviors. Don't necessarily think that you are the best person to teach your child how to drive. Your kid is really best off learning from a professional driving school. And I am not talking about the driver's ed that they offer in high school. I have looked at those programs and, nothing against our school systems, but driver's ed in America sucks. I'm just going to say that. Driver's ed in America sucks. They teach your kid how to pass the test, and that's it. Even a lot of the professional driving schools, that you can send your kids to, some of them are really great. Some of them are not. They're still about passing the tests, learning the rules of the road, which is extremely important, but they're not necessarily teaching your kid good car control skills, understanding how the vehicle works, driving under more adverse conditions, such as really slippery roads. What do they do when they're driving behind a truck and something falls off the back of that truck into their path and they have to take evasive action? These things happen on the roads. And most drivers in general are not skilled enough and trained and experienced to handle those adverse situations, much less our teenagers. So on this soapbox, I always strongly recommend sending your kid to a good driving school. Now, my definition of a good driving school is one that puts them through hell over a series of many, many hours and teaches them those adverse driving skills so that they are safe on the road. This company called Teen Driving Solutions School, they operate out of the VIR, the Virginia International Raceway. And don't let that scare you. It's just they happen to have an interior little road course that they allow this school to teach on that is a good place to run the school. It's a nonprofit. They are not paying me to advertise for them. I happen to know the people who run it. They are fantastic people. The guy who founded it, he founded it because his own son was in a horrific accident. And they're very passionate about keeping kids safe. And they're professional drivers. The guy that runs the school, Chuck Hawks, is a friend of mine. He's one of the top driving coaches in the country. He has been one of my coaches. And so they put your kid through a full weekend. They're behind the wheel of a car about 12 hours and literally put them through hell so that when it happens on the road, if there's some distraction or something goes flying into the car, a water bottle gets thrown into their seat, something crazy happens, they've already dealt with it in a controlled environment with an instructor. And they actually track your child's driving for a few years after they go through this school. And in the history that the school has been running, only one kid has been in an accident since taking the driving school. And they analyzed the situation and realized there was nothing that kid could have done. She did everything right, but it was just a crazy situation. So their motto is arrive alive every time. And because they're a nonprofit, it is extremely cost effective. I think their tickets are still, or their prices are still under $700 or $800 for an entire weekend. And you as a parent get to go with them and go through a parallel course that teaches you how to be a good driving coach in the car and not a completely freaked out parent. So we're going to take a really quick break. teendrivingsolutions.org is their website. I will put that link into the metadata for this podcast. I'm going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about specifically what cars are good for your kid and what else you can do as a parent to help keep your child safe on the road. Be back in 60 seconds. Do you hate car shopping? Do you worry about being taken advantage of or about finding the right car at a fair price? Buying a car can be a frustrating and time-consuming experience. But what if you could get a great deal without having to do a ton of research, without having to haggle, and without the fear of buying a lemon? You can. As your personal car shopper, the Car Chick will help you pick the perfect car based on your unique lifestyle, budget, and personality. She'll handle all of the legwork and negotiating for you. All you have to do is sign the papers and take the keys. It's that easy. To learn how the Car Chick can save you time, money, and hassle on your next car purchase, give us a call at 888-575-2138. That's 888-575-2138. Or visit us on the web at thecarchick.com.
Ah, the Car Chick is back for more Straight Shift.
And we are back to the Straight Shift talking about keeping our teenage drivers safe on the road. So let's talk a little bit about the specifics of the type of cars that are the best to buy for your teenagers, because this comes up all the time when I am helping my clients get cars for their teens. And there's always the battle between the parent and the child. The child wants something really cool and fast and expensive, and the parents want something safe and reliable and cheap. So where do we find this middle ground? And while I don't think you should compromise on the safety of the car, you need to, be able to find something that your kid's going to at least accept and understand that this is a good car for their first car. And, helping them understand that owning a car it's a privilege and it's a responsibility. It's just not something that's a given. And so having any kind of vehicle of their own at all is huge. Not every kid gets their own car. And that even brings up the debate of should the kid even have their own car and versus driving one of the family vehicles. And again, that depends on, your family logistics situation as well as the insurance. Because sometimes, depending on what kind of car you drive, if you drive a really nice luxury car, then it's probably not a good idea to have your kid driving that car. Just talk to your insurance agent about that, because it could be astronomically more expensive to have the child as a secondary driver on your fancy car versus having them be the primary driver on their own modest car. So the first question that most of the parents ask me when we're shopping for a car for their teenager is, how much should I spend? I'd really like to spend about $2,000 on a car for my kid because I know they're going to wreck it. And then I say, well, you have to balance what you spend with what you get. When I grew up, my first car was a complete piece of crap. Let's just throw that out there. And I loved it, of course. And it was a compromise with what I wanted versus what my mother wanted me to drive. But, the 80s were also a very different time. And so, yeah, this car left me stranded on the side of the road, I think like 2 days before Christmas on a completely rural road. And my friend Lisa and I had to walk to, a stranger's house and knock on the door because this was before cell phones, of course. And, Santa Claus answered the door because this guy had just gotten off work at the mall as the mall Santa. And, fortunately, he was a nice guy and not a serial killer and let us use his phone. And I called my dad. But we live in a little more dangerous world now. And yes, our kids have cell phones, and that's great. They absolutely, if they're driving, they absolutely need a cell phone, just not allowed to use it while they're driving. But we also want to give them something that's going to be a little bit more reliable because, especially if your kid's going to be driving after dark, you really don't want them broken down on the side of the road. And if you buy a $2,000 car, there's a really good chance that that's going to happen unless you're willing to put several more $1,000s into that car to make it safer and more reliable. You also want to get a car that's, as new as possible to have airbags. And I mean lots and lots and lots of airbags, not just the front airbags, but the curtain ones, the side ones, the ones in the seat, as many airbags as you can get. And your insurance agent will probably tell you that as well. So it becomes a balance of safety and reliability versus cost. Now, I don't think you should get them a brand new car either because one, they haven't really earned it. Buying a brand new car is a privilege and something that maybe they should look forward to achieving on their own when they become an adult and, have a good job and become a participating member of our society. Obviously, that's a parental decision. But your insurance agent will probably also tell you that putting your kid in a brand new car, the rates are going to be astronomical because it's going to be a more expensive car to repair or replace if something does happen. So I tell my clients that are shopping for cars for their teenagers, if you can, spend between, say, $8,000 and $12,000 because that's going to allow us to get a decent vehicle. It's going to be a few years old, and it's going to have a little bit of miles on it, but it's not going to be, astronomically high. It's not going to be an old clunker that could be a little more dangerous. My favorite things to buy for teenagers are, a small 4-cylinder, not too small, not tiny, but, kind of a mid-size, a Toyota Corolla, a Camry, kind of something in that range. 4 cylinders. They want to have just enough power to be able to drive smoothly through traffic, and be able to pull out into traffic the correct way, but not so much power that they're going to get themselves in trouble. And it's so funny because if my teenage self could hear me talking right now, I would smack myself because I was like every other teenager and wanted a crazy fast car. And I did end up with a sports car when I was a teenager. So yeah, okay, I'm a hypocrite. But now that I'm an adult and I look back and I see my mother's point of view now so clearly, it's just kind of ironic. But if your kid wants an SUV, because a lot of times, parents think, oh, they'll be safer in an SUV. They'll be up a little higher. They can see a little more. That's fine. Stick with the small SUVs, something like a Toyota RAV4, a Honda CR-V, something in that category, because it's not going to have a V6. It's not going to have the more powerful engine. It's not such a big vehicle that it will be harder for them to control if they have to take evasive action. So again, it's a balance between, control of the vehicle and how safe the vehicle is. Now, a lot of parents say they want to get their kid a newer car because they want the car to have all the driver aids, all these things that I've talked about in previous podcasts, like the collision mitigation, automatic braking, the lane keeping, all of those, what I call electronic babysitters. Here's my thoughts on that for teenagers. And again, this is a parental decision. And since I don't have kids, I'm not qualified to make that decision, but I do have a professional opinion about that. Those driver aids are making adult drivers worse drivers because the people that have those things, Most of them are starting to rely on them, and it's actually causing them to pay less attention to their driving because they think, I don't have to pay attention. I can sit here and look at my phone because if anything comes up, the car will just stop itself and handle it and I'll be fine. That is not driving. That's not even aiming. So when kids learn to drive a car that has these babysitters, they learn to rely on them, standard. It's kind of like, they've grown up now with cell phones. And so they don't know what to do if they're in a situation where they don't have a cell phone. They've never lived without a cell phone. They, think that connectivity is always right there in their hand. They don't know that, back in my day, if we had a problem, we had to go, find a payphone or knock on somebody's door and hope they aren't a serial killer and ask to borrow their phone. They don't know how to handle situations where the technology that they have grown up with and become accustomed to isn't available to them. I mean, if they were suddenly on a deserted island with no internet, oh my God, what would they do? And the same thing applies to these driver aids. If they learn to drive a car that has them, that's all they know how to drive. So if they get into a different car, let's say they're at a party and the friend they went there with has been drinking and they do have the courage to say, you've been drinking, you're not driving, give me your keys. I will drive us home because I'm smart enough to not drink. But that car is very different and doesn't have a lot of these newer technologies. They're not going to know how to drive it. The reason that I learned how to drive on a manual transmission vehicle when I was a teenager, 100 years ago, was because my father said, first of all, that's driving. An automatic isn't driving, it's just aiming. And so he wanted me to learn how to actually drive. But I remember very specifically, he said, you need to know how to drive a stick shift, because if you were ever in a situation where you were the only person who is safely qualified to drive that car, if everybody else is drunk or incapacitated in some way, and the only vehicle available is a stick shift, you need to be able to know how to drive it. Now, that situation is not likely to happen these days because it's hard to find a car with a manual transmission. But that was kind of the technology and the mindset, back in the 80s when I was learning to drive. And, nowadays it's the same thing with the fancy technologies. Your kid needs to know how to drive a normal car that doesn't have all these fancy babysitters or fancy technologies, because they might find themselves in a more basic car that they have to be the safe driver in. So we also just don't want them to become reliant on those technologies. You can't rely on the car to keep your kid safe. Not entirely. Yes, the car should be safe. Yes, it should have a zillion airbags. It should have 5-star crash test ratings. But your kid is still the number one safety feature in that car. And the child needs to learn how to drive. The bells and whistles on the car are just kind of added bonus safety features. So I don't necessarily think that the kid should have a car with those features until they learn how to drive themselves and learn how to minimize distractions and be a good, safe, attentive driver on their own. Okay, I'm going to try and get off my soapbox now. So, when buying a car for your kid, look for something that, is modestly priced, new enough to have a lot of the airbags and good crash test ratings, but not necessarily so new that it has all the fancy technology. And you don't really want it to have things like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, all the smartphone integration, because you do not want that smartphone to integrate it all with the child in the car. If there's one thing that you can do as a parent to keep your kids safe, is to implement and enforce a zero phone policy in the car. And guess what? That means you have to abide by that too, so you're not a hypocrite. Don't talk on the phone in the car. Bluetooth does not keep you safer. Talking on the car, even hands-free, is still highly distracting. It's as distracting as being a little bit drunk in the car. So setting some boundaries for your kids, letting them know that they have to wear their seatbelt. Everyone in the car always has to be wearing their seatbelt at all times. That was my parents' number one rule. Limiting, the first year that your kid is behind the wheel and has his or her license, limiting the number of people that can be in the car with him or her. For the first 6 months that I had my license, I was not allowed to drive with anybody in the car except my mom or dad. And that drove me crazy. I was, so furious because all my friends were like, oh, you got your license. Let's go, here, there, wherever. And I couldn't. I said, I can't. I'm not allowed to have anybody in the car with me. And I felt like such a dweeb. But now, of course, as an adult, looking back, I'm very grateful to my mother for implementing that because I was still a new driver. And other kids are one of the biggest distractions. So, setting a policy of no other drivers other than, a parent in the car while you're driving for the first 6 months to a year is a really good idea. Absolutely no phones. The phone stays in your backpack, in your purse, in the glove box, somewhere where you cannot see it or touch it while you are driving. Those are going to be some huge things that can keep your kid and everybody else on the road safe. And you may even choose to invest in what's called an event data recorder that will actually monitor your child's driving. Chevy has implemented this into the technology of their cars. They're the first manufacturer to do this. And, I find it both really amazing and also a little bit frightening, from a big brotherish standpoint. But it's called their teen driver technology, and it's literally a built-in babysitter to the car. So what you do is you register one of the keys that comes with the car. You register that key, and that becomes your child's key. And so just like you can program cars that have memory seats and you can program, the seating position of the car to a specific key so that you and your spouse have different settings, this is how this key works for your kid. And you as a parent can set parameters in the car, like a maximum speed, even the maximum volume of the radio. And then every time your kid drives and puts that key in the car starts watching them and recording them and monitoring their behavior. And then when they come home, you can then get in the car and pull up a report card. And it gives you data on, was your kid wearing a seatbelt the whole time the car was operating? How fast was he or she driving? There's even a wide open throttle parameter that shows, did they ever go wide open throttle? Did they ever have to engage any of the driver aids? Did the traction control system ever kick on? Now, that may not be a behavior thing. It may simply have been raining and they hit a slick spot. But, did the collision mitigation system have to kick in because your kid wasn't paying attention and the car had to stop itself? It gives you about 7 or 8, even up to 10 different parameters that grade your child and tell you exactly how your kid was driving. It's a little frightening that, such a massive big brother invasion of privacy exists. But again, this is a parental thing, and it's a decision that you as a parent have to make with your child. Where do you draw that line of invading their privacy versus monitoring them and making sure that they are staying within the boundaries that you have set for their behavior as the parent, and, being able to monitor that? If I had a car with a system like that as a kid, first of all, I would be dead because my parents would have killed me by now. At least my mother would have. But, I would have hated it. But you know what? I also would have stayed within those parameters because I didn't want to get into trouble because I knew somebody was watching. And that's, with kids, most of the time they're getting into trouble. It's because they know nobody's watching and they think they can get away with it. And, I was certainly no exception to that. There are still a laundry list of things, usually involving motor vehicles, that my mother still doesn't know about to this day. And I'm going to be in trouble once she listens to this podcast. But, having something to monitor your kids' behavior when they're behind the wheel is not necessarily a bad thing. But again, that's a parental decision. But I wanted you to know that technology does exist. And, even if, you don't have a newer Chevy that has this technology, you can get different types of event data recorders. A lot of insurance companies are providing them now. It's just this little, what's called a dongle, and it, plugs into the port on your car that your mechanic plugs into to talk to your car. That's the data recorder for the car anyway. So a lot of these things exist. They exist at a very low cost, and, they can help you. Insurance companies will use it to even help monitor your driving and give you lower insurance rates based on good driving behaviors because they can monitor your driving behaviors. Clearly, this is why I do not have one of these in my car, because that would just be really hilarious. But, do as I say, not as I do. I'm a trained professional driver. But these are some things that you can do to keep your kids safe on the road. And please don't ever underestimate the influence that your own behaviors have, that your kids are watching when they're in the car with you and have been watching since they were little, how that's going to impact, what type of driver they become. And finally, just one last thing that I want to, throw on out there. I've been on my soapbox this whole podcast, but like I said, I'm very passionate about keeping our kids and everybody else safe on the road. Also teach your child that owning a car is about a lot more than just putting gas in it. Make sure they understand what you're paying for their insurance. And, they should probably pay a little bit of that themselves too, just so they kind of get used to this is one of the costs associated with owning a car. But teach them about good maintenance, understanding that you have to change the oil, you have to change the fluids, you have to keep an eye on your tire tread and when those are wearing out and making sure the tires are rotated properly. I recommend to my clients that make it the responsibility of the child to keep a maintenance log for their car. And you guys monitor that maintenance log together. And even if you don't have them pay for the maintenance, they still need to be responsible for helping you to track it so that they get in the behavior of understanding maintenance is a part of owning a car. It's not just about having enough money to put gas in it. There's a lot more that goes into it. And that will help them when they become an independent adult and they'll know, okay, car, I have to maintain it. I have to make sure that I can pay for the maintenance, the insurance, and everything else, not just the gas. That is one of those adulting skills that I don't see a lot of kids learning, and therefore they become neglectful car owners when they get out there on their own because they were never taught how to maintain a car. So, driving is one of the biggest adulting skills that we can pass on to our children, and it needs to be kind of an all-inclusive skill, everything involving with owning a car, owning it, maintaining it, insuring it, and driving it safely. So thank you for listening to my soapbox, folks. I really just want everybody to stay safe on the road, especially our kids. And, my nephew was very, very lucky, and he came out of that horrible accident alive, although he does have a rod in his leg now, and it will affect him for the rest of his life. But he was really damn lucky, really, really lucky to be alive. And the accident was in no way his fault. He did everything he could to avoid it. But unfortunately, the reality is not everybody else out there is safe either. So we need to do everything we can to help keep our kids safe. So once again, that school I was talking about earlier is Teen Driving Solutions School, teendrivingsolutions.org. Definitely check it out if you are anywhere in the North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, Southeast area. It is well worth the modest price tag that they charge as a nonprofit, and it will make your kid a much, 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 much better driver. Thanks so much for listening, folks. Everybody, whether you're a teenager or an adult, drive safely. Talk to you next time.
The Straight Shift Podcast is copyright LeeAnn Shattuck, The Car Chick, 2017. All views expressed by guest and or co-hosts are those of the guest and or co-hosts, and not necessarily those of LeeAnn Shattuck or The Car Chick.